It was just such a great career to travel like we did and go to Europe and see things that we never dreamed we could and be paid to do it.
Welcome to Flip Your Script, the podcast about life's critical turning points and how people find the inspiration and motivation to move forward and rewrite their unique stories. Flip Your Script is produced by Media Minefield, a public relations firm passionate about the power of sharing stories. Specializing in earned and social media, Media Minefield helps clients take control of their unique story and message. The show is hosted by Kristi Piehl, founder and CEO of Media Minefield, who flipped her script from an Emmy-winning journalist to a successful entrepreneur and speaker.
Today, you're going to learn, and I promise you're going to laugh. Jeannie White's story and experience will remind you just how far we as women and as society have come. To give you a bit of background, Jeannie and I met this summer. Her husband's daughter is a close friend, and my family and I got to spend a few days with Jeannie's family. Every night, Jeannie would share stories, and I knew the Flip Your Script audience would want to hear them. Jeannie began working as a flight attendant in 1969. Over her 43-year career, she had a front row seat for history as an industry flipped its script, specifically as it relates to women in the workplace and the expectations and experience of an airline traveler. Buckle up. This is going to be a fantastic conversation. Jeannie, welcome to the Flip Your Script podcast.
Oh, thank you, Kristi. It's lovely to be here and see you again.
It is so interesting to think about how far the world has shifted because we talked about this before. A lot of conversations are happening about how far the world has to go and all the problems and all the issues we have to deal with. But you saw how one industry shifted over the course of a few decades in pretty remarkable ways. So let's start with why you decided to be a flight attendant in the late 60s.
Okay, in the late 60s, I was in college and I was at a crossroads because I did not want to be a teacher. I did not want to be a secretary, and I did not want to be a nurse. And those were the three industries that most people my age at the time went into. And I wanted to travel. I'd always loved traveling. I hadn't traveled extensively, but enough to know that I wanted to get out of the small town that I lived in. And so I decided to pursue a career as a stewardess, as we were known back in 1969.
It's really interesting that in thinking about the world at that time, because I think we all have to think about the context of what was going on then, women were expected to go into a few different careers and get married, right? The getting married part was pretty much an accepted reality, right?
Right, definitely.
So when you choose to be a stewardess, which it's weird to say the word, but if you choose to be a stewardess at that time, you're in college. Did you have to go to more school? Was it something that you traveled somewhere to take tell me about how that classes were.
Well, it started with an interview from an airline at my campus. And so I went to the interview, and it was a group interview where a lot of different students attended. And then they said they would let you know within a couple of weeks if they wanted you to come back for another interview. So they never selected anyone and gave them the job on the scene at the time. You would get a letter. And I got a letter saying that I was not accepted. So okay, well, maybe I'll try another airline. So I left school at the end of that semester and went home, and I tried to interview with several other different airlines and did not get accepted. And I was very down and out about the whole thing. He started working for my father in his insurance company. And one day I went home for lunch, and when I was leaving, the phone rang, and I ran back in the house, picked it up, and it was an airline that I had initially interviewed with at college. And they said, we kept you in our database and we wondered if you're still interested in the job. And I was like, oh, well, yes, definitely. And they said, well, first question we're going to ask you is, have you lost any weight? And I was shocked. I said, well, sure, I've lost weight. I'm surprised that you would ask that. And they said, well, if you have, we'll set up an interview because we really were interested in you a year ago. So we'll set up another interview in 2 weeks. And they gave me a time and place. And so I told my parents about it. My mom says, well, you're going on celery, carrots, and chicken strips for 2 weeks. And the funny thing is, I was shocked at the question. But so when I walked into that interview, I weighed 107 pounds. I guess I weighed maybe 115 or 16 when I didn't get the job the first go round. So it was amazing. And so I go into the interview and they asked me some current event questions that I had the answer to. And they said, we will give you a date for your physical and you've got the job. But there's such a huge emphasis back then on weight. And I mean, you had to be tiny. So, I mean, that's just crazy.
And we do, for the purpose of this conversation, we are not mentioning the name of the airline because it doesn't matter. You had a wonderful, wonderful career with this airline, and this was the industry. This was the state of the world. This is not in any way any sort of reflection of one company. This conversation is about how the world looked at that time. So you get the question, which I imagine collectively all the people listening have their mouths hanging wide open. The first question they ask is, how much do you weigh? And then you tell your family and your family says, well, let's get her on a diet. Let's get her this job, right? So you go in, you have the correct weight that they've decided is your correct weight, and then you get this job. So what other factors were they looking for? Because weight was one, but there were other factors that had you failed, it wasn't about how good you would have been working on the airline. It was some other things that they, as a society, had decided you couldn't be. Like you couldn't be married, right? What else couldn't you be besides heavy, which I don't even want to say the word heavy, like normal, I guess, right?
So back in 69, you had to be single, of course. You could have never been married before. You had to be between the ages of 20 and 25. 25 was the absolute limit. You could start at 19 as long as you turned 20 in training. And training was 5.5 weeks long. You had to sign a legal document once you had graduated from training and were working that you would quit at the age of 32. They didn't want anyone older than 32 being a stewardess. So, I mean, and at that point, when you're 21, as I was, you're thinking, oh, 32. I mean, that's forever. That's no problem. Nobody worried about it. And the average life expectancy of the job back then was about 18 months to 21 months. Most people didn't even look at that as a reality.
Because you'd get married, right?
Yeah, definitely. That wasn't the next thing I was going to say. Yeah, people would get married and then you had to quit. But some people did get married and did not tell the airline and then just hid it and had separate phones. But some people got caught and others were able to sail through until the law was changed.
So you really got into this industry at sort of a sweet spot because obviously you worked past being married, you worked past having kids, you worked past all these things. But when you started, was the mindset at the time because they wanted young, pretty women and being married somehow took away from that? Or was it that once you get married, you should really be with your husband and if you're traveling, you can't? Like, what was the reason?
And they just wanted single eligible people. And then some of the CEOs said, well, a woman's place is in the home with her husband anyway. So once you get married, you're no longer eligible as a single person. And so they would use that excuse, which was pretty lame.
And it's funny because I've spent time with you. You're not a big woman. You're a slight petite woman. And if an airplane is going down and someone needs to be moving my family out of the way, I don't want a bunch of 107-pound people responsible for, opening the door. So I think it's really interesting that, 107 pounds is some ideal, but that tells you that it wasn't about doing the job, because the job wasn't about opening doors and moving things. It was really about looking a certain way for the men who were traveling, right? Because it was men mostly traveling.
Yes, mostly businessmen and couples on vacation, that sort of thing.
And what would happen if you showed up 1 pound over? Did they send you home and you got paid? Could you take off a shoe? I mean, what happened?
If you were 1 pound over, you were taken off the trip, and you were replaced by a reserve that was standing by for this reason, in case something happened or someone got sick or got in an accident on their way to work. They had reserves, were ready to go. And but if you weighed in over 4 times for 4 different trips, then you were taken off the line completely for 4 to 6 weeks. And all of this was without pay. So it was definitely a huge incentive to not put on the weight. And that's how they looked at it.
Yeah, terrifying. Did you at the time ever think or talk with your fellow stewardesses about how difficult, annoying, sexist, I don't know, fill in the blank word, that policy was? Or was this just how it was?
We all absolutely detested the whole thing. But that's how it was. So if you wanted the job, you put up with it.
So in that environment, when there's so much focus on body image and looks and all of the things about external, was there a lot of sexual harassment happening from the passengers? Were there a lot of men talking about your appearance as well, or not?
Yes, there was some of that, and some from pilots. And I mean, it was just the uniform skirts were just above the knee. I mean, not terribly short. You had no say in what you were wearing, because when you graduated from training, they provided you with a uniform and you had to pay for it. And then after that, the airline, about every 2 years, would change the entire uniform. I mean, completely different, total different style. And then they would furnish you the new uniform. You wouldn't have to pay for it. You only paid for it once. But when we had uniform changeover, even if you had a layover that night, you would wear your old uniform on your trip and then pack the new uniform. And then in the morning, everybody would show up in a whole new outfit because everybody throughout the country had to have on the same thing on day one of the new uniform. So that was and most people left the old one in the hotel room to be thrown away because they didn't want to haul it around and they were sick of it.
I'm sure after wearing it for that long. So if you have these different uniforms and there's so much emphasis on how you look all the time, you told me a story when we were talking before about the gloves and just the cleanliness of the gloves and how important these gloves were. Can you share that about how that it wasn't just how much you weighed, it also was what your uniform looked like?
Yes, we had to wear white gloves and they had to be sparkling clean. So part of that appearance check that we would get, we'd have weight check, appearance check. And if the gloves were dirty, you would be sent home for that too. So everything added up. And your hair had to be a certain length. It couldn't be more than 6 inches from the nape of your neck. And if it was long like that, it had to be fastened at the nape of your neck. And they called that style the George Washington. If it wasn't, and that style, then it had to be really short or just chin length. You had no option. But if you really wanted to grow your hair out, you'd have to wear a wig and a short wig. So everybody was wearing wigs. I had 7 wigs, all colors. It was crazy.
And can you imagine if someone would have showed up with a tattoo? I mean, they would have like lost their mind.
Yeah. Oh, and you couldn't wear glasses either, and in some cases, contacts even. So you had to have perfect vision. But all these things really started changing dramatically in the very early 70s. And in fact, in 1972, they decided to let males try to get this job. And we were all horrified. What? Men are going to come? I mean, how are we going to lay over? Because we would have 2 to a room. So there was all kinds of logistics that had to be worked out. But a lot of men were, young men our age, wanted the job. And so they'd been discriminated against for years. So they put together a lawsuit of some kind. And all of a sudden, they now get to join this group. And that's when we changed to being called flight attendants. No longer stewardesses. We became flight attendants in 1972 when the men came in.
Did they have the same weight rules and appearance rules for the men, or did that end at the same time?
No, the weight thing went on for years, and they did too. They had weight requirements as well.
And so also at some point you're able to get married and you're able to have children. So the weight restrictions go away and things loosen up, and it's just kind of a slow fade to where it kind of comes more aligned with women working and men working in other areas. Was it so shocking to be right there when all of these historic changes are happening and you're right at the front of it all?
It was to see everything that you'd been hammered into was now okay. And I mean, another thing that was very unusual was the whole thing about smoking on an airplane, because everybody could smoke anywhere on the airplane initially. And we even had cigarettes on the meal tray as a giveaway, like 4 cigarettes in a little pack. And that was something that everybody expected and liked. And the whole cabin was blue with smoke, and it was horrible. And flight attendants at that point, called flight attendants, they were allowed to smoke, but we had to smoke in the galley if we wanted to smoke, or go in the cockpit. And the captain would come out before boarding and he'd say, "Oh, if any of you guys want to come up for a cigarette during the flight, feel free, one at a time." And to think about being in a cockpit, because there were 3 pilots in the cockpit then, but nobody thought about smoking then. Every seat had an ashtray. Then people started becoming aware in the 70s that this was really, really detrimental. And so they enacted a smoking section. So in first class, like the smoking section would be the last 3 rows, and the front of first class would be non-smoking, the same in coach. But as you know, even 1 cigarette can pollute a whole cabin, much less a whole section. So that went on for years and years. And flight attendants were at the forefront of fighting the government to try and get that change to have no smoking. And it was a terrible fight that went on for years.
I can't imagine being in a flight from San Francisco to London and everyone's smoking. I mean, the amount of smoke in an airplane must have just been hard to see, breathe. I remember as a child flying with the smoking section. And even then it was normal and it was progress because there was a smoking section, but a smoking section on an airplane is just a ridiculous concept. So I imagine that was difficult to work in. And thank goodness you got to change those uniforms every couple of years. They must have just been horrible.
Mm-hmm. And, you come to work with clean hair, and 5 minutes into the workday, your hair smells like smoke.
Well, something else that changed pretty dramatically was, post 9/11, so much of the industry changed. And you were talking about some of the tasks that you used to do as a flight attendant and carving meat, which was so surprising to me. Can you talk about that? Like the idea of someone having a knife on an airplane is so wild. And that was part of what you were expected to do while the airplane is up, 10,000 feet. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, first I'll do a quick thing about in the early 70s, we went to the gate one day for our flight, and the agent came up and said, I want to ask you a favor for there's 3 of us in the crew. He said, we're going to put a table out here in front of the door to the jetway. And we're going to just start looking in people's suitcases just to see maybe if they have a gun or they got something dangerous. And you don't have to do it. It's not part of your job description. And we were unionized. So the union was very strict about don't do this, don't do that. It's not in your contract. So the agent was well aware of that when they asked us. So they said, okay, people are going to come up and we're going to tell them, open your suitcase and you're going to help us look for bad stuff. And we're like, whoa. And that was the first time I'd ever heard about security of any kind. And that was a result of hijackings. So they were in the throes of figuring that out when they asked us to do this. But then the school of thought was, if you make people go through a metal detector, that's going to scare them. They're going to think, and it's an invasion of their privacy. They're not going to like that. So there was all this controversy for a long time about how do we make this happen? And they finally realized that they had to do something, and that was the beginning of real security. And that was certainly enhanced 100% after 9/11.
So there was the security that you saw. As to me, your whole experience and your career really is a reflection of what was happening in America, unlike other industries where they saw pieces of it, but you saw what was happening on the security side. You saw what was happening with equality. You saw what was happening with just the change in society around gender and race and so many different things. So I asked it earlier, the knife. Tell me about the
Yes.
carving. That's so crazy to me.
We had a service in first class that was very extensive. It was like an 8-course meal. And the main course was a prime rib. And you could have a choice of several other things. But if you picked a prime rib, it was carved at your table on a cart.
While you're in the air. Like, this didn't happen on the ground.
Yes. And it was all for enhanced service because everything was draped in white linens and there were flowers on the cart and crystal. And this isn't even going international. This is just going across the US, where now you get a box. But back then they had this very extensive service. And if you left the cart to go to the galley to get somebody chicken that was sitting next to the guy that wanted prime rib, that butcher knife is just sitting there unattended. And nobody gave any thought to that sort of thing. It was just a crazy situation now to look back and see that how far we've come in everything, really. This was another interesting thing on how things have evolved in the industry. Nowadays, as soon as the door shuts and the demonstration is done, the safety demonstration, we are to sit down, strap in, and never get up again until it's time to start working. And when you land, also, you stay in your seat until the plane stops. Well, back then, you had to stay up until takeoff because you had to appear that you were busy and working and not lazy sitting down. So we would be passing out magazines. I mean, we don't even have magazines anymore on the airplane, but we would have to take a whole big armful of magazines and give them out to the people. And then later on in the flight, go and pick them all up and redistribute them to everybody else at the second time. And then on landing, you would have to start passing back coats when you're taxiing, because back then we had no overhead bins. So the only thing that could be overhead was your hats and your coats, because all your luggage had to be under the seat in front of you because there was no cabinetry above you. It's hard to believe that anything you brought on had to completely fit under the seat in front of you, including a suitcase. But the seats were bigger then, and a regular carry-on bag would fit. But now it certainly would in most cases. But we'd have to pass back all these coats and hats and be trying to stand up when the airplane's kind of starting and stopping, and totally unsafe. And we always knew it was unsafe, but it took the FAA to tell the airlines, no, you can't do that anymore. These people they're safety professionals. They're here for one reason, to evacuate the airplane if need be. And wasting your time doing stuff like that is it's very unsafe. So safety has come so far comparatively from the late 60s.
Can you imagine taking your youngest, your daughter, and putting her on that airplane in the 70s? Can you imagine? I mean, her mind would just be blown. All the different things that are crazy, so different. And again, in a short time, I mean, a few decades, and so many things changed. And you also, in your career, had a lot of fun stories with celebrities and run-ins with people, and you, again, can entertain for hours with your stories. So is there one that you want to share, like one celebrity or interesting thing that you got to do that you'd like to share?
In Las Vegas, we would always go to the door of the showroom at midnight when we would get in. And if there were any seats available for the midnight show, the maitre d' would let us in. And usually we got some very good seats. But this particular show, we were at the very back of the showroom. And we're watching Lena Horne was the first act for Bill Cosby. And so we're watching that. And all of a sudden I realized that Bill Cosby is standing right at our table. And he said, "Oh, are you enjoying the show?" And we said, "Yeah, this is really great. What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I go on next. And I just thought maybe you girls would like to come down to my dressing room after the show. I usually have a little get together and it's a lot of fun. And then we go up and we have dinner and gamble and blah, blah, blah." And he was just one of my favorite comedians at the time. And I just thought the world of him, like the whole world did. So after the show, we started to head there, and then thinking, I don't know if this is a good idea. And just as we were turning around to leave, he came out of his dressing room and says, where have you guys been? I've been waiting for you. So we said, okay. So we walked in, and he said, come on in the other room. There was another man in there. It was another flight attendant and myself. And he said, you make drinks all day long on the plane for everybody, and you guys work so hard. And basically my trip to the bank after work is so much better than yours because, what I do. And he said, let me make you a drink. How about you have a drink? What would you like?
I feel like right now we should cue some scary music. Could we just have some horror music start playing in the background? Okay, so keep going. I'm sorry. So Bill Cosby's, just to set the stage, you and another 107 to 115 pound single beautiful flight attendant are in Las Vegas, and Bill Cosby is about to make you a drink. Okay, go.
So he makes us a drink, and we take 2 sips, and then he says, okay, let's go upstairs. We're going to have dinner. And so we did. We went upstairs, and he had his special table, and we sat there, the 4 of us, and we ordered dinner. And then he got up and went to the one of the gaming tables and won $10,000 in 2 seconds, and then came back, and different people came up and said, "Oh, Mr. Crosby, can I have your autograph?" And he was very, very nice to everybody. And I mean, this went on till like 2:30 in the morning. And I went home the next day and I was just like, wow, this was such an experience. And then years later to see what this man was capable of. And I don't know what he might have put in that drink, but I think knowing that we worked for an airline that has to be on schedule every day in and out of there, because we went there all the time, to do something that could curtail the whole crew from ever being able to get up and leave in the next day might have been a good incentive to not do what he ended up doing to a lot of other people.
Because he knew that you had a flight in the morning. That was part of your conversation. So had he done something to you and you would have slept through, that would have raised some red flags.
Yeah, definitely. And he couldn't have been nicer. I mean, it was a great experience. And you're shocked later on in life to see how his life turned out. It's really, really sad. You never would have guessed that that would happen.
And that's just one of the experiences that you had, that your career put you in these situations that had you gone down a different career path, teacher, nurse, bank teller. There's nothing wrong with those careers, but they're not quite as adventuresome and being right there on the travel, exciting. And that was the life that you wanted, was to have this exciting adventure. And you got that. And you got that for many, many years. So in looking at your whole career and in thinking about it now, you're retired, you have a wonderful family, you're living in Florida. What did you take away from your career? What do you talk about with your family about your career? What are the things that have resonated with you? Is it that you're so grateful you had that opportunity? Or what is it that we can take from your experience besides the fact that, oh my goodness, the world has shifted?
Well, I'm very grateful that I had the job, and I have very close friends that live near me here now and throughout the country that you still keep in touch with, that we all had similar stories and similar things that we did, and we share different times that we had, and we have get-togethers, and it's always fun to hear another story from another flight attendant that had another crazy thing to say, and you would share things back and forth. And it was just such a great career to travel like we did and go to Europe and see things that we never dreamed we could and be paid to do it.
When you fly now, Jeannie, is there one thing that you wish you could bring from the 60s, 70s to current times? Is there one thing that in all the changes, again, we can't make the security changes, 9/11 happened, and I'm not talking about those types of things, because every now and then I hear someone complaining that they don't have cutlery and they have to use plastic. But I mean, those things happen. But is there something from back then that you could bring forward that you think would make the whole flying experience more enjoyable, better? Or are all the changes better that have happened?
I think the changes are better, but I really notice as I travel on different airlines that I don't think people have the zeal for the job as much as my generation did starting. I mean, you see people that are not as energetic about it, and then some are. It's certainly not pervasive, I wouldn't say, but I mean, like nowadays in certain airlines, people do the demonstration and the whole thing is a sing-songy joke, and they're making fun of everything, and they're just trying to make it interesting, and they're still getting the message across, but it's just a little different. I don't know. I loved the job, and it was very tough to retire, but it was time. And so
I do remember as a passenger a time when it was important to dress up, to travel. And I think it was because not everyone got to fly. It wasn't quite as accessible. And so to your point about the passion, I do think that the passion on the people who do the job is maybe less, because I don't hear people, it's not fair to put everyone in one category, but the way that you talk about it is really, you have a lot of passion and you love that work. It wasn't ever a job for you. And I think the same way for passengers. You know, it used to be something that was worth getting dressed up for, and it was an experience. And I think we've forgotten that, you know, we get all bent out of shape that, oh no, I didn't get my headphones or the screen isn't working. And we forget that we should be really lucky that we can get from point A to point B safely in something that 100 years ago would have been crazy to think about, right? So to your point, this gratitude piece I think is important. And just for people, you know, listening, I think there's value in asking questions, because I met you. The point of our meeting was never about, let's talk about Jeannie's career. And you don't ever complain about it. You talk about it like it's this wonderful, fantastic time. You don't ever start with, can you believe they weighed us? I mean, that was me asking question after question after question. So I just want to be clear that there's a lot of value in meeting someone and getting really curious, because I learned so much from you. And you don't think you're that interesting, but you're really interesting because you're someone who had a front row seat to see the world change in a lot of different ways. And there's value in that. And my kids got to see that, and they got to hear from you. And it was so interesting. And you're not an old lady. You're a very vibrant woman who, it's surprising to me that you worked at this time when you got on a scale every day, because that seems like it should have been like dinosaurs were on the planet then. But that's how fast things can change if we're willing to be patient and to catch up with some of the wrongs in the world.
You just didn't question anything back then. You were just thankful to have the job. At least I certainly was. And if that's what they wanted, that's what they wanted. And we didn't like it, but we just did what we had to do.
In reading some of getting ready to talk with you, a lot of people fought in your industry to make the changes, so that women and men weren't being weighed and could get married and all of these things. So there are some brave people out there who may or may not hear this, who did some work behind the scenes so that you could have this career that lasted for decades. When you started, you didn't think you could even get 10 years out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you thought maximum 3. And now some people have flown till they're 80 years old. It's really amazing.
It was such a joy to talk with you. It always is. I look forward to the next time we're together and I can hear more stories. The last question always on the podcast is there a quote or something that you'd like to share that maybe motivated you or inspired you as you saw the world shift from the sky?
One of the songs that's meaningful for my generation in the air was Leaving on a Jet Plane by John Denver. When you hear that, you think of the 60s, the 70s, and just leaving your boyfriend and can't wait to get back.
Well, thank you for sharing so many stories. It was, again, a pleasure to hear from you. And I think the things to take away from the conversation are about gratitude and about knowing that change and positive change can happen, is possible. And the next time I get on an airplane and want to complain about someone who brought McDonald's on or some smell, I will be grateful that nobody's smoking, because that would be worse.
Right, for sure.
My hope is that Jeannie's story empowers you to believe you're capable of more than you think, to discover motivation, to uncover inspiration, and to find the strength to turn the page.
Thank you for listening to Flip Your Script, hosted by Kristi Piehl and produced by Media Minefield. If you like our message, please be sure to give us a 5-star rating, subscribe to the show, and share our episodes with your family and friends. Do you or someone you know have a story about flipping your script? We'd love to share it. Contact us on our website, flipyourscriptpodcast.com. To stay up to date on all things Flip Your Script, make sure to follow host Kristi Piehl on social media. You can also check out the website for pictures, resources mentioned in the show, and other great episodes.